The Galactic Classification Bureau operated on a simple principle. If it existed, it could be categorized, filed, and forgotten about in triplicate. Their masterwork, the Universal Species and Planetary Registry, had taken 17,000 years to compile and contained exactly 4,827 entries, each more bureaucratically pristine than the last. Unfortunately, like most bureaucratic masterworks, it was also magnificently wrong about nearly everything that mattered. Take their classification of DeathWorlders, for instance. According to Form GCB 7749X, a DeathWorlder was any sentient being evolved on a Class 12 hazardous environment, characterized by excessive gravitational forces, atmospheric toxicity, predatory ecosystems, and general inhospitability to civilized life. The definition was clinical, precise, and utterly failed to capture the essential truth that DeathWorlders were less a classification and more a cosmic joke played on the rest of the galaxy. The bureaucrats, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that beings from such worlds were inherently violent, unpredictable, and generally unsuitable for polite galactic society. This assessment was based on rigorous scientific analysis, meaning they'd asked 3 different species about humans, received 3 different answers ranging from terrifying to absolutely mental, and called it consensus. The fact that humans had invented things like extreme sports, spicy food challenges, and reality television only confirmed their worst suspicion. What the Classification Bureau failed to grasp was that DeathWorlders weren't violent because they enjoyed it, though some certainly did, but because they'd spent millions of years evolving on planets that actively tried to murder them on a daily basis. This created a certain pragmatic approach to problem solving that more civilized species found deeply unsettling. When your ancestors survived ice ages by wearing mammoth fur and eating whatever didn't eat them first, you developed a remarkably flexible definition of impossible. The Enforcement Division's tribunal chamber had been designed to intimidate, which it accomplished through a combination of soaring architecture, ominous lighting, and judges who looked like they'd been selected specifically for their ability to loom menacingly. The 3-member panel consisted of Judge Vextari, whose crystalline features could have cut glass, Judge Mordunai, who resembled a cross between a praying mantis and a philosophy professor, and Chief Judge Kelmoria, whose species had evolved past the need for facial expressions but had somehow retained the ability to radiate disappointment. The defendant stood in the center of the chamber, looking remarkably unimpressed for someone facing exile. This was, the judges agreed, typical DeathWorlder arrogance. They'd reviewed her file thoroughly. She'd been involved in 17 incidents, ranging from bar fights to what the report euphemistically called creative disagreements with station security. That she'd won most of these encounters only proved their point about DeathWorlder brutality. The defendant will approach for sentencing, Chief Judge Kelmorian intoned, his voice carrying the weight of galactic authority and several centuries of judicial pomposity. Judge Vextari consulted her crystalline datapad with the sort of satisfaction that comes from having the universe neatly organized into proper categories. The Enforcement Division has determined that traditional rehabilitation has proven inadequate. Therefore, the defendant shall be exiled to Cathara Sanctuary, a Class 2 peaceful environment, designated for contemplative reformation. The judges had spent considerable time selecting this destination. Cathara Sanctuary was, according to their files, a tranquil world of gentle meadows and meditative silence, perfect for teaching DeathWorlders the value of peaceful existence. The planet's entry in the registry described harmonious ecosystems, breathable atmosphere, and abundant natural beauty conducive to spiritual growth. It sounded absolutely perfect for breaking a DeathWorlder's violent tendencies through prolonged exposure to aggressive serenity. Judge Mordunai leaned forward, his compound eyes glittering with what might have been satisfaction. Perhaps extended contemplation of true peace will teach you the error of your primitive ways. The transport departs within the hour. What none of them bothered to notice was the small notation in the corner of Cathara Sanctuary's file. See also Cathara Prime classification pending review. But bureaucrats, as a species, had evolved past the need for attention to detail. The transport vessel Redemptive Journey was designed for prisoner comfort, assuming prisoners deserved minimal comfort and maximum reflection time. The journey to Cathara Sanctuary would take 47 standard hours, during which the defendant was expected to contemplate her violent past and emerge spiritually renewed. The ship's navigation system had been programmed with the coordinates from the Tribunal's order. Cathara Sanctuary, Sector 7. What it actually locked onto were the coordinates for Cathara Prime, Sector 7. 23 hours into the journey, the ship's proximity alarms began screaming warnings about atmospheric hostility, electromagnetic interference, and what the computer diplomatically termed biosignature anomalies. The transport pod's emergency systems activated, jettisoning its passenger toward what the sensors assured everyone was definitely, absolutely, certainly a peaceful meditation retreat. The pod's descent through Cathara Prime's atmosphere was accompanied by the sort of turbulence that suggested the planet's weather patterns had been designed by someone with a particularly vindictive sense of humor. Lightning crackled across alien skies while winds that could have powered a small city tossed the pod like cosmic dice. The crash landing was less a landing and more a controlled catastrophe, with the pod carving a smoking furrow through vegetation that looked decidedly unmeditated. As emergency systems hissed and sparked around her, the pod's occupant pulled herself upright and looked out at her new home. Through the cracked viewport, Cathara Prime stretched away in all directions, a world of jagged mountains, acid green seas and forests that seemed to writhe with malevolent life. In the distance, something that was definitely not a peaceful meditation creature let out a roar that made earthquake tremors sound like lullabies. The Galactic Classification Bureau had outdone themselves once again. The first sign that Cathara Prime wasn't exactly the spiritual retreat advertised came when something with too many teeth and not enough regard for personal space tried to eat the escape pod while she was still climbing out of it. The creature looked like someone had crossed a shark with a bulldozer and given it anger management issues. Its jaws, each tooth the size of a dinner plate, clamped down on the pod's hull with a sound like industrial machinery having an emotional breakdown. What followed was less a graceful exit from her transport, and more an undignified scramble involving emergency flares, creative profanity, and the discovery that the creature's hide was apparently bulletproof. The beast, which she mentally classified as a hull muncher, seemed genuinely surprised when she didn't immediately die of terror. This confusion lasted approximately 30 seconds, until she introduced it to the concept of percussive maintenance, via a salvaged plasma cutter, applied to what she hoped were non-vital areas. The hull muncher retreated with what might have been respect, or possibly just bewilderment, that its dinner was fighting back with power tool. Either way, it left her alone with her smoking pod and the growing realization that the Galactic Classification Bureau's idea of peaceful meditation involved significantly more mortal peril than advertised. Over the next 6 hours, she encountered what could generously be called the local welcoming committee. There were the crystal wolves, transparent predators, that hunted in perfectly coordinated packs, and could apparently turn their bodies into living prisms that focused sunlight into death rays. Then came the acid spitters, which looked like oversized toads but secreted compounds that could melt through starship hull plate. Her personal favorite was the shadow cats, feline predators, that existed partially in another dimension, and had the deeply unsporting habit of attacking from directions that technically didn't exist. Each encounter followed a similar pattern. Terrifying creature appeared. Demonstrates why it's the apex predator of its particular ecological niche, discovers that its new prey has some extremely unconventional ideas about how predator-prey relationships should work, and retreats to reconsider its life choices. The shadow cats in particular seemed offended that she'd figured out how to kick them while they were phased into their alternate dimension. Apparently interdimensional combat techniques weren't covered in. Meanwhile, 47 light-years away in the sterile corridors of Galactic Enforcement Headquarters, Administrator Cathara was having the sort of day that made bureaucrats question their career choices. The morning had started normally enough: coffee, status reports, and the usual complaints about DeathWorlder behavioral problems. Then someone in records had noticed a small discrepancy in the transportation log. "Sir," his assistant had said with the sort of careful tone that preceded career-ending revelations about that exile to Cathara Sanctuary, "there seems to have been a clerical error." The error, as errors in galactic bureaucracy tended to be, was both simple and catastrophic. The coordinates for Cathara Sanctuary had been confused with those for Cathara. The mix-up had occurred because some junior clerk had abbreviated both entries as Cath-San and Cath-Pri respectively, and the navigation computer had apparently decided that close enough was good enough when dealing with exile destination. Administrator Kulthara stared at the correction request with the sort of expression usually reserved for discovering that one's morning coffee contained industrial lubricant. How long has she been there? Approximately 18 standard hours, and the survival rate for unprotected visitors to Cathara Prime. Kulthara began composing what he suspected would be his resignation letter. The Enforcement Division had just accidentally sent a DeathWorlder to a world that made DeathWorlds look like vacation resort. The political ramifications alone would require a full senatorial inquiry, assuming there was anything left to inquire about. Back on Cathara Prime, the defendant was discovering that survival on a world designed by cosmic sadists required a certain philosophical flexibility. When the local ecosystem insisted on treating you as a mobile snack bar, the reasonable response was to explain firmly and repeatedly why this was a poor business model. The plasma cutter helped with these explanations, as did a growing collection of improvised weapons crafted from pod wreckage and predator anatomy. The turning point came during her encounter with what she'd dubbed the Disco Raptors pack hunters, with bioluminescent scales that could coordinate light displays for group hypnosis. The creatures had surrounded her with their usual confidence, beginning their mesmerizing light show while moving in for what they clearly considered an easy kill. The problem with hypnotic light displays, she discovered, was that they worked best on species that hadn't evolved on a world where pretty lights in the sky usually meant either incoming meteor or volcanic eruption. DeathWorlders had learned through millions of years of trial and error that attractive things in nature were generally trying to kill you in creative ways. Instead of falling into a hypnotic trance, she watched their light show with the sort of analytical interest usually reserved for studying technical manuals. The pattern was actually quite sophisticated, geometric forms that shifted through mathematical progressions designed to overload neural processing centers. Fascinating really if you weren't planning to be eaten at the end of it. When the lead raptor leaped forward for the killing strike, it discovered that its hypnotized prey had spent the light show positioning herself next to a convenient boulder. The raptor's leap ended with a sound like a hammer hitting a watermelon, and the rest of the pack suddenly found their confidence significantly diminished. The pack retreated, but not before the lead raptor, still conscious but clearly reconsidering its dietary choices, made what could only be described as a submissive posture. It lowered its luminescent head, dimmed its scales, and backed away with the sort of careful respect usually reserved for creatures that outranked you in the food chain. For the first time since arriving on Cathara Prime, she found herself genuinely smiling. The Galactic Classification Bureau had been wrong about many things, but they'd been spectacularly wrong about what constituted a peaceful meditation retreat. This wasn't punishment, this was the universe's most expensive self-improvement course, and she was apparently passing with honors. By the end of her first week on Cathara Prime, the local ecosystem had developed what could charitably be called trust issues regarding the newcomer. The problem wasn't that she was particularly violent, though her creative use of salvage technology had certainly made an impression, but rather that she refused to follow the established rules of predator-prey relationships that had governed the planet for millions of years. The rules were simple: big things ate smaller things ran away or died, and the natural order maintained itself through a carefully balanced system of mutual terror. What the rules didn't account for was a species that responded to being hunted by taking extensive notes, improvising countermeasures, and then having the unmitigated audacity to hunt back. The crystalline wolves had been the first to discover this uncomfortable truth. After their initial encounter, they'd returned in greater numbers, employing their signature tactic of surrounding prey while using their prismatic bodies to create disorienting light patterns. It was a strategy that had worked flawlessly for approximately 3 million years, right up until they encountered something that had learned to fight dirty on a world where fighting dirty was considered basic survival etiquette. She'd spent 2 days studying their hunting patterns, noting how they positioned themselves for optimal light refraction, and identifying the pack hierarchy through careful observation of their coordination signals. Then she'd introduced them to the concept of asymmetric warfare, by rigging a series of reflective surfaces that turned their own light-focusing ability against them. The resulting chaos had left the pack temporarily blinded, thoroughly confused, and dealing with what appeared to be the first case of sunburn in crystalline wolf evolutionary history. The pack leader, a magnificent specimen, whose crystal hide could probably power a small starship, had approached her afterward with something that looked suspiciously like curiosity. Instead of the usual predatory stalking, it had walked directly toward her, stopped at what seemed to be a respectful distance, and simply watched. When she didn't immediately attack or flee, it had done something unprecedented in crystalline wolf behavior. It had sat down. The acid-spitting toads had required a different approach entirely. Their strategy relied on overwhelming prey with sheer numbers, while dissolving anything that tried to fight back. Unfortunately for them, DeathWorlders had extensive experience with creatures that employed chemical warfare, having evolved alongside everything from venomous snakes to plants that could cause anaphylactic shock through casual contact. Her solution had been elegantly simple. She'd started collecting their acid secretions. Within 3 days, she'd developed a primitive but effective chemical arsenal that could dissolve through most organic matter and several types of metal. The toads, faced with prey that not only survived their attacks but was apparently learning to replicate them, had collectively decided that perhaps this particular corner of their territory wasn't worth defending after all. The shadow cats had presented the most interesting challenge, primarily because fighting creatures that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously required a fundamental reconsideration of combat tactics. Standard weapons were useless against enemies that could phase in and out of reality at will, and their ability to attack from non-existent directions made conventional defensive strategies thoroughly inadequate. The breakthrough had come when she realized that while the cats could phase between dimensions, they still needed to anchor themselves to local reality in order to actually affect anything. By carefully timing her counterattacks to coincide with their materialization, she'd managed to convince them that their interdimensional advantages weren't quite as decisive as they'd previously believed. The discovery that she could predict their phase transitions by watching for subtle reality distortions had apparently violated several fundamental assumptions about how prey was supposed to behave. What she hadn't realized was that her unconventional survival methods were being interpreted by the local fauna as something far more significant than simple self-defense. In the complex social hierarchies of apex predators, certain behaviors carried specific meanings that transcended species boundaries. Defeating a pack leader in single combat, for instance, was universally understood as a dominance challenge. Studying enemy tactics before developing countermeasures was recognized as strategic thinking. Claiming territory through superior force while demonstrating mercy to defeated opponents was the hallmark of established authority. The crystalline wolves had been the first to recognize these patterns. Their pack structure was built around respect for superior tactical intelligence, and her systematic dismantling of their hunting strategies had registered as exactly the sort of leadership behavior they'd evolved to follow. When their pack leader had sat down in her presence, it wasn't curiosity, it was acknowledgement of a new alpha. The acid toads had reached similar conclusions through different reasoning. Their species had survived by recognizing and avoiding superior chemical weapons, and her rapid adaptation of their own secretions had marked her as something beyond their ability to challenge. Their retreat hadn't been tactical, it had been tribute, the acknowledgement of a creature that had mastered their primary evolutionary advantage and improved upon it. Even the shadow cats, whose multidimensional existence had made them effectively immune to conventional predator hierarchies, had begun demonstrating behaviors that suggested a fundamental shift in their relationship with local reality. They'd started leaving offerings, the choicest parts of their kills, at the edge of what they now apparently considered her territory. The tipping point had come during her second week when a territorial dispute between rival predator species had erupted near her crash site. The crystalline wolves and a pack of metal-scaled raptors had been engaged in the sort of savage territorial warfare that typically left the landscape littered with casualties and established new boundaries through pure attrition. She'd resolved the conflict by walking directly into the middle of the battle and explaining through a combination of improvised sign language and strategic deployment of her various weapons that the noise was disturbing her sleep schedule. Both sides had immediately ceased hostilities, not because they feared her personally, but because intervening in apex predator territorial disputes was the sort of behavior that could only come from something so far up the food chain that conventional predator politics simply didn't apply. The crystalline wolves had backed down first, their pack leader approaching her with what she now recognized as a formal submission posture. The metal raptors had followed suit moments later, their alpha performing what appeared to be some sort of ritualized deference display. Within minutes, both packs had reorganized themselves around her position, effectively establishing her as the arbiter of their territorial boundaries.
By the end of her third week on Kithara Prime, she'd accidentally acquired what could only be described as a court. The crystalline wolves served as her primary enforcers, their prismatic abilities making them ideal for long-range reconnaissance and communication. The acid toads had become her chemical weapons specialists, providing both offensive capabilities and terrain modification service. Even the shadow cats had found their niche as interdimensional scouts, using their phase-shifting abilities to monitor threats from adjacent reality layers. The irony wasn't lost on her that the Galactic Enforcement Division had sentenced her to exile for antisocial behavior, only to accidentally place her in a position where antisocial behavior was the primary qualification for leadership. Kithara Prime didn't want a reformed criminal. It needed someone who understood that civilization was just organized violence with better public relations. The rescue mission arrived on Kithara Prime with all the pomp and circumstance the Galactic Enforcement Division could muster, which was considerable, given that they were trying to cover up what was arguably the most spectacular bureaucratic failure in recorded galactic history. The task force consisted of 3 heavy cruisers, 2 specialized environmental ships, and enough firepower to sterilize a small moon, all deployed to retrieve one presumably deceased exile from a world that killed everything stupid enough to land on. Commander Zithkol, a veteran of 17 different peacekeeping operations, had volunteered for the mission primarily because his career was already circling the drain after an incident involving illegal gambling and a diplomatic reception. Leading a recovery operation to a Class X death world seemed like exactly the sort of heroically doomed gesture that might restore his reputation, assuming he survived long enough to file a report. The fleet's approach to Kithara Prime had been textbook perfect: synchronized orbital insertion, comprehensive sensor sweeps, and deployment of atmospheric probes designed to locate any possible survivor traces. What they found instead was a planet that appeared to be experiencing some sort of ecological revolution. The sensor readings showed massive shifts in territorial boundaries, unprecedented interspecies cooperation, and what the analysis computers kept flagging as anomalous behavioral patterns in apex predator population. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Veltara, her voice carrying the sort of confusion that came from staring at data that made no sense. "We're detecting organized movement patterns across multiple predator species. The computer thinks they're coordinated." Commander Zithkul studied the tactical displays with growing bewilderment. Kithara Prime's ecosystem was supposed to be a chaotic free-for-all, where every creature spent its time either eating or avoiding being eaten. Instead, the scans showed what looked suspiciously like patrol routes, territorial agreements, and something that could only be described as a chain of command extending across species lines.
"Are we looking at the right planet?" he asked.
Though he already knew the answer. The distinctive electromagnetic signature of Kithara Prime's acid seas was unmistakable, as was the unique atmospheric composition that made breathing without environmental suits inadvisable for most species. The landing party that descended to the crash site consisted of 12 heavily armed specialists, equipped with the sort of environmental protection typically reserved for exploring the cores of dying stars. They moved in perfect formation, weapons ready, prepared for immediate evacuation, the moment they confirmed what everyone assumed would be the inevitable, that the exile had become another entry in Kithara Prime's lengthy casualty statistic. What they found instead was a clearing that had been transformed into something resembling a fortified compound. The original escape pod had been extensively modified, its hull reinforced with what appeared to be crystalline wolfhide and metallic raptor scale. Surrounding the structure were defensive positions that showed clear signs of planning and engineering, along with what could only be described as trophy collections, organized displays of teeth, claws, and other anatomical souvenirs from various apex predators. "Movement, sir," whispered Sergeant Kulthun, his voice tight with professional tension. "Multiple contacts, all sides." The rescue team found themselves surrounded by creatures that shouldn't have been able to cooperate, led by species that had never demonstrated coordinated behavior in recorded galactic history. Crystalline wolves emerged from concealed positions with the sort of tactical precision usually seen in military units. Acid toads arranged themselves in supporting formations that maximized their chemical weapons coverage. Most unsettling of all, shadow cats began phasing in and out of reality along their flanks, their interdimensional movements clearly coordinated with the purely physical positioning of their ally. "Hold position," Commander Stithkull ordered, though his voice carried less authority than he would have preferred. "We're here on a rescue mission. we mean no harm to the local ecosystem. That was when she emerged from the modified pod, looking remarkably well-fed and thoroughly unimpressed by the arrival of her supposed rescuers. 3 months on a world that killed professional survey teams in hours had left her with a deep tan, an impressive collection of scars and what appeared to be a crown made from the fused scales of at least 6 different apex predator species. "You're late," she observed, settling into what could only be described as a throne constructed from crystalline wolf hide and supported by the reinforced skeleton of something that had probably been very large and very dangerous. "I stopped expecting rescue around the time I figured out that the Classification Bureau can't tell the difference between a meditation retreat and a cosmic abattoir." The rescue team's formation wavered as they realized that their target wasn't just alive. She was clearly thriving in ways that defied several fundamental laws of ecology and common sense. More disturbing still was the obvious deference being shown by creatures that made their worst nightmares look like domesticated pets. The crystalline wolves had arranged themselves as an honor guard, their prismatic hides casting rainbow patterns across the clearing. The acid toads maintained what was clearly a defensive perimeter, their chemical weapons ready but not actively threatening. Even the shadow cats seemed to be showing respect, their interdimensional movements carefully controlled to avoid any appearance of aggression. "Ma'am," Commander Stithcole began, then stopped as he realized he had no idea how to address someone who had apparently become the undisputed ruler of a world that specialized in creative forms of homicide. "We're here to extract you from this hostile environment. The Enforcement Division has prepared a full pardon and compensation package for the administrative error that resulted in your relocation." Her laugh carried the sort of amusement that came from hearing something genuinely hilarious after months of life and death serious. "Administrative error, is that what you're calling it? I was sentenced to peaceful meditation on a tranquil world, and you delivered me to a place where the flowers try to digest you and the local wildlife considers interdimensional assassination a recreational activity." She gestured to her assembled court of apex predators, each species represented by specimens that looked like they could single-handedly devastate a small military installation. "But you know what? I think the career opportunities here are unprecedented. The benefits package includes absolute territorial sovereignty, and my colleagues are finally the sort of people who understand that violence is just problem-solving with better teeth."
The rescue team exchanged glances that conveyed months of hazard pay calculations and the growing realization that their mission had evolved well beyond simple personnel recovery. Commander Stithcole found himself faced with the uncomfortable truth that the Galactic Enforcement Division accidentally created exactly the sort of problem they'd been trying to solve: a DeathWorlder with unlimited authority and a personal army of creatures that made military nightmares look optimistic. "The Enforcement Division will want to debrief you about your experiences," he said, though his heart clearly wasn't in the attempt. "There are procedures for situations like this." "I'm sure there are," she replied, scratching behind what appeared to be the crystalline equivalent of a wolf's ear. The creature, which could have served as the main gun on a light cruiser, rumbled contentedly. "But I suspect your procedures don't cover accidentally crowning someone Queen of Hell's vacation resort. The paperwork alone would probably require a new department." 3 hours later, the rescue fleet departed Cathara Prime with empty transport bays and reports that would require extensive creative editing before they could be filed with any government agency that valued its sanity. The official record would show that the exile had been successfully relocated to a position of her choosing, which was technically accurate, while avoiding any mention of interspecies political structures that violated most known laws of evolutionary biology. Back in the sterile corridors of Galactic Enforcement Headquarters, Administrator Kalethara quietly reclassified both the Exile and Cathara Prime under a new category he'd invented specifically for situations that defied rational explanation. Administrative success. Do not investigate further. The Galactic Classification Bureau, meanwhile, updated their files to indicate that Cathara Prime was now under local management and should be considered politically stable but diplomatically inadvisable for standard contact protocols. And on Cathara Prime, in a clearing that had become the unofficial capital of the galaxy's most dangerous unrecognized nation, the accidental queen of apex predators settled back into her throne and began planning improvements to her kingdom. After all, if the universe was going to hand you a planet full of creatures that specialized in creative violence, the only reasonable response was to help them achieve their full potential. The Galactic Classification Bureau had been right about one thing. DeathWorlders were indeed unsuitable for civilized galactic society. they were much better at running their own.